The former prison was sited on the former RAF Long Kesh Air Base, which comprised of runways and associated buildings including hangars, and later an army base of the same name. The site is relatively flat, forming low-lying bog, which prior to the RAF phase was undeveloped. A series of razor wire fences following historic field boundaries and landscape features demark the perimeter of the site, which is irregular in shape, being some 360 acres. The site is entered via the extern gate at the northeast corner, a former staff and goods entrance to the prison. Visitors' parking and reception was via the bog road. The prison occupied a large central portion of the site, with the former Long Kesh Army Barracks, largely demolished to its east. The majority of the prison was contained within a continuous high concrete perimeter wall, which was about 2.1 miles long, punctuated with watchtowers and flanked by a tarmac access road surrounding its length. The area to the west of the prison perimeter walls retained a stretch of the former main runway and ancillary staff buildings and a firing range. To the north of the prison's perimeter wall was a linear area which retained 2 RAF hangars and other associated buildings which included blast shelters. To the south of the prison was a similar linear area which retained 2 walled M&E plants and several of the Army-manned watchtowers that surrounded the perimeter walls. The prison itself comprised of 2 main components: the Long Kesh Internment Center, also known as the cages, and the prison itself known as the H-blocks. The compounds comprised the earliest prison enclosure and formed the eastern portion of the overall area within the perimeter walls. It formed an irregular parcel of land divided from the cellular by a similar wall to the perimeter wall. Compounds of huts were arranged around the pattern of the original Long Kesh airfield. The compound housed the original internment cages. These were a series of small compounds defined by high perimeter fences and comprising of Nissen huts and small structures. A standard compound arrangement included 3 dormitory Nissen huts with a 4th accommodating dining and recreation, and a purpose-built timber hut ablution block. Each compound housed different paramilitary factions and was patrolled by guard and dog. The compounds were sparse, normally with concrete or tarmac ground covering. Also within this area were the former administrative and other buildings associated with the running and control of the Long Kesh compounds, including a punishment block, hospital and prison staff facilities. Subzones reflected the organizational arrangement and development of the compound area. Vehicle access to the compound was located in the eastern perimeter wall. Overall, the area is much overgrown and deteriorated. Long Kesh Cellular to the west postdates the compound, forming a larger enclosure defined by a continuation of the high perimeter wall. This area was accessed via a main gate located on the north wall at its west end. The area was divided into distinct and controlled zones: an administrative area retaining entrance and visits block, governor's office, hospital and support structures, a temporary visitor center, inmate search block, and Phase 2 of the H blocks 3, 4, and 5, and also Phase 3 of the H blocks 6, 7, and 8, together with sports grounds and ancillary structures. Within both the compound and cellular areas, there were internal boundary walls, fences, and dead zones, referred to as inertias. Standard airlocks, an arrangement of 2 gates at each end of a fenced enclosure, were located at each breach of the high perimeter walls or internal walls, controlling movement through the prison. The whole area was typified by grayness and lack of color. The lack of any view out of the H-block compounds to hills in the distance was striking. Strung between walls and helping to emphasize a sense of enclosure outside the buildings were wires with plastic toilet floats attached to prevent helicopter access. The prison compounds, thoroughfares, and perimeter were monitored from observation towers located at key points within the complex. These towers comprised of 3 distinct types reflecting their function and location, with variations dependent on the date of construction and any specialized use. Primary observation towers were located outside the perimeter of the cellular prison and were manned by Army personnel supplied by the Long Kesh Army Camp. These monitored both the inertias within the perimeter and the hinterland between the perimeter wall and the site boundary fence, along with the main cellular entrance. Occupants were armed, and because of the tower's location and function, were the most heavily fortified and tallest of the observation towers. Secondary and tertiary towers were located within the perimeter of the prison. Both were staffed by unarmed members of the prison service and consequently became known as NIPS towers. Secondary towers were located throughout the prison and had 2 distinct types. The majority were located adjacent to internal link gates and controlled the movement through the airlocks with control of the gate opening mechanism. These were less well defended than the primary towers, but were still secured at ground level with lockable doors. In key areas such as around the visits, complex's secondary towers were located away from the gates. The least secure and smallest of the towers were located to the north and south of the H blocks, serving to monitor the activities of inmates and exercise yards. Prior to the construction of the prison, the site formed RAF Long Kesh, established in 1941. An area of field systems were converted to provide a main east-west runway, with secondary runways aligned southeast to northwest and southwest to northeast. These were linked to frying pan hardstandings and taxiways. The majority of the buildings were located to the east of the site, where 2 hangars were located. A further 2 hangars were located to the south and west of the runways, along with the 2 surviving hangars to the north of the main runway, used in the construction of Sterling aircraft. Following closure in 1945, the base formed the Army's Command Vehicle Park and the location of the Ulster and Short Gliding Club. The Gliding Club continued until 1969, when the land was acquired to build the Long Kesh internment compounds. 2 hangars and associated shelters survived and were utilized during the prison phase of the site. RAF Long Kesh was deemed suitable for the internment detention center, with existing services Nissen huts being arranged in groups to form sectarian compounds. The 2 north-south runways were used as hardstanding for the compounds, with additional support structures and a perimeter wall being added. By the beginning of 1972, following the introduction in March of direct rule, 20 huts had been built, and the internment center started receiving people. From June of that year, these detainees were granted special category status. The compounds were controlled by an officer commanding OC. Each paramilitary group had an OC who acted as spokesperson and a first point of contact between that group and the governor of the prison. This system was used in both the compounds and the cellular blocks. In October 1974, nearly all of the compounds were set on fire and destroyed or severely damaged. Following the publication of the Gardner Report in January 1975, the Secretary of State announced that H blocks were to be built on the site as an interim measure while a permanent prison was built. The H blocks were built from prefabricated components, enabling rapid construction of reinforced concrete floors, walls, and ceilings to create cells. Prefabricated prison elements was pioneered in the USA in Louisiana's Angola State Penitentiary in 1955. In June 1975, 2 of the H blocks, H1 and H2, had been built, forming Phase 1 of the new prison. These 2 were occupied by October. H3, 4, and 5 were built, forming Phase 2, and H6, H7, and H8, forming Phase 3, were under construction. On the 15th September 1976, Republican prisoners refused to wear prison clothes, demanding the reinstatement of political status and commensurate privileges. Blankets were worn in protest and became known as the blanket protest, with the authorities further removing their privileges in reaction. This resulted in an escalation of the protests. The protests continued, with more than 300 prisoners involved by the end of 1978. By this time, the protests had escalated, with Republican prisoners starting the No Wash protest, covering their cell walls with excreta, heightening tensions between staff and prisoners. The prisoners received degrading and inhuman treatment from prison staff, and during this period there was an increase in the paramilitary activity against prison staff, with 12 staff and 1 senior member of the management team losing their lives. On October 27, 1980, 7 Republican prisoners started the first of what became known as hunger strikes. The strikers were drawn from lists of volunteers compiled in H3, H4, and H5. The hunger strike finished on December 18, 1980. In an act of support, No Wash and hunger strikes were carried out at Armagh Women's Prison. Also, 30 Republicans in the H blocks joined the protest. The Republican demands were to be able to wear their own clothes, refrain from prison work, have free association, have weekly parcel and visits, and the restoration of lost remission. A second hunger strike was started by volunteer Bobby Sands, the IRA prisoners' OC, on March 1, 1981. The protest was supported by fellow Republican prisoners, with representatives from the 2 Republican organizations joining him. In April, the Irish Republican Socialist Party and People's Democracy won 2 seats in the Belfast City Council elections, and Bobby Sands won the by-election in Fermanagh and South Tyrone on April 9th to Westminster. Volunteer Bobby Sands died a month later in the hospital block on May 5th after 66 days without food. A crowd of over 100,000 people attended his funeral. A further 9 hunger strikers died in the hospital during the hunger strikes. Volunteer Francis Hughes, Irish Republican Army, died on May 12, 1981. Volunteer Raymond McCreish, Irish Republican Army, died on May 21, 1981. Volunteer Patsy O'Hara, Irish National Liberation Army, died on May 21, 1981. Volunteer Joe McDonnell, Irish Republican Army, died on July 8, 1981. Volunteer Martin Herson, Irish Republican Army, died on July 13, 1981. Volunteer Kevin Lynch, Irish National Liberation Army, died on August 1, 1981. Volunteer Kieran Doherty, Irish Republican Army, died on August 2, 1981. Volunteer Thomas McKilwee, Irish Republican Army, died on August 8, 1981. Volunteer Michael Devine, Irish National Liberation Army, died on August 20, 1981. In September 1983, 38 Republican prisoners escaped, in which one prison officer died and a number of others were injured. Along with a heightening of general security concerns, resulted in the closure of the existing cellular entrance and visits compound, and the creation, immediately to the east, of a new entrance and visits complex. Following the Good Friday Agreement in 1997, the release of prisoners from Long Kesh was accelerated. By September 29, 2000, the prison was vacant, and only 2 of the H blocks, 4 and 5, were kept in serviceable order. On April 1, 2004, the British government relinquished control of the site. Demolition of the Long Kesh site began on December 5, 2006. Just one block, H Block 6, remains standing. The hospital and part of the site are currently listed buildings, and would remain as part of a proposed site redevelopment as a conflict transformation center. The historical significance of the whole prison, in relation to the Troubles, is high, with the structures, imagery, and even name being synonymous with the conflict.
I have not sought private advantage or profit by the sufferings and struggles of my oppressed countrymen. Robert Emmett.